some fun. Tune in late at night or tune in the sun. This is TFM. Get ready to rock. From AM to PM. Come on. Let's talk.
TFM 95.4.
Let's talk.
Live on TFM and the TFM Facebook page. This is the live feed of TTV. Let's talk.
Hello and welcome to Midday Update. These are the latest news from our newsroom. The Ministry of Health today announced the registration of 6 new coronavirus deaths in the country today. The death toll has now touched 609 in Oman due to the virus so far, the officials at the Ministry of Health has informed. They also extended their deepest condolences to the family of the deceased. Officials at the Ministry of Health also announced the registration of 163 new coronavirus cases in the country today. This has brought the total number of coronavirus cases registered in the Sultanate to 83,769. According to the Ministry of Health, this number also includes the recovery of 78,386 patients and 609 deaths. The ministry has urged everyone to adhere to social distancing instructions issued by the Supreme Committee and the Ministry of Health, as well as staying at home and not going out unnecessary. Break. It's time for a quick commercial break, but stay tuned as we have more latest updates your way. Welcome back to TTV. You're watching Midday Update. The Ministry of Endowments and Religious Affairs has confirmed that Friday, 21st August, will be the first day of the Islamic New Year. According to the statement issued by the ministry, the sighting of the moon of Muharram on Wednesday was not proven, and this Friday will be the first day of Muharram corresponding to August 21st, 2020. According to the decision issued by the Diwan Royal Court, Sunday will be an official holiday on the occasion of the new Hijri year. The decision said that if the 1st of Muharram is on Friday, corresponding to 21st August 2020, the holiday will be on Sunday, 3rd Muharram, corresponding to 23rd August 2020. On the occasion of the new Hijri year and the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ Hijrah, His Majesty Sultan Haitham bin Tariq has exchanged greetings cables and with leaders of the sisterly and friendly Arab and Muslim countries. In his cables, His Majesty the Sultan expressed his sincere greetings and best wishes of good health, happiness and long life for them, praying to the Allah Almighty for the return of His blessed occasion for them and make the new year a year of blessings for all people and achieve for the Islamic nation further progress, welfare and prosperity. In their cables to the country's monarch, the leaders of the sisterly and friendly countries express their sincere greetings and best wishes of good health, happiness and a long life to His Majesty Sultan, praying to Allah the Almighty for the return of this blessed occasion on His Majesty for many years to come to achieve all aspirations of further progress, welfare and prosperity for His faithful people and all the Muslims' further welfare and progress. The Ministry of Health in the Sultanate will not be issuing a daily statement on COVID-19 situation during the weekends and on official holidays. The ministry said in a statement, the ministry will stop issuing the daily statement on the COVID-19 cases during weekends and official holidays. We will commit to wearing masks and follow social and physical distancing to protect ourselves, our families, and our society from coronavirus, the statement added further. The Patients and Client Services Department at the Ministry of Health has implemented significant measures to reduce the spread of the novel coronavirus and protect both employees and clients from the infection. The Director of Patient Services, Dr. Abil Mamri, outlined several measures in a statement. Starting with, the department closed the reception hall and started to receive the applications and inquiries via emails and department's phones. It also implemented the downsizing of personnel, asking them to work remotely and with periodic monitoring to ensure that no services are delayed, the statement said. Al-Mamri added that the department has continued to provide all its assigned services amidst the pandemic and under the current circumstances. The department receives many inquiries related to the pandemic in general and is offering consultation to the inquiries of both citizens and residents. The department continues to communicate with the hospitals and wards to solve issues related to patients, in addition to supervising and monitoring administrative procedures for transferring referred patients to the referral hospitals. Moreover, the department also receives inquiries and requests related to appointments and treatment and contributes to scheduling the return of citizens who are receiving treatment outside the Sultanate in cooperation with the Department of Treatment Abroad. The Royal Hospital has published a scientific paper that analyzes the existence of a link between a particular fungus and COVID-19 infection. A statement issued online by the Royal Hospital said that the scientific paper summarized analysis of a group of scientific studies that showed the existence of a link between a scientific type of fungus and infection with the COVID-19 among intensive care patients on one hand and its effect on the high mortality rate on the other hand. The paper, entitled Fungus Related to Infection with COVID-19, explained that most of the patients infected with this fungus were those who had a central intravenous line for medicines, and it was removed as soon as they were diagnosed and put on broad-spectrum antibiotics. The statement confirmed that the scientific paper included 5 cases that were diagnosed in a hospital, out of which 3 of them died and 2 survived. The statement also pointed out that the paper concluded that length of stay in the hospital, surgical procedures, central vein line, and broad-spectrum antibiotic use. It may result in an increased risk of infection with these fungi. While the paper stressed the importance of paying attention to symptoms and warning signs that may contribute to early diagnosis and thus starting appropriate treatment immediately in order to enhance the patient's response to treatment optimally, the statement concluded. The Ministry of Regional Municipalities and Water Resources has published a rainfall report on the Vilayat situation with rain stations in Oman from 16 to 18th August 2020. Vilayat of Nizwa station in Ad-Dakhliya Governorate recorded the highest percentage of water rain, amounted to 78 millimeters. Dhang recorded 34 millimeters. Bahla recorded 30 millimeters, followed by vilayats of Ibri, Ibra, Al-Khabura, Al-Hamra and other vilayats in the Sultanate. While 5 millimeters each has been recorded in Vilayat Buremi and Mahda station, and the lowest amount of water rain was recorded at Thumrait station at 1 millimeters. On the occasion of the World Humanitarian Day, the Oman Public Health Promotion Society, known as PHPS, on Wednesday honored the volunteers of the Ad Life Hospital in Al Amirat. It was established as part of Muafa initiative, which means Together for Oman, that has been launched by the Oman Medical Association. The World Humanitarian Day, which falls on 19th August, is an international day dedicated to recognizing humanitarian personnel and those who have lost their lives working for humanitarian causes. Her Highness Sayyida Mona bint Fahad Al Said, Oman PHPS Honorary President, patronized the honoring ceremony virtually. The honoree included the frontline volunteers, doctors, nurses, students and administrators in the Ad Life Hospital, along with the medical cadres of the Ministry of Health. In this regard, Dr. Fana Al-Aremi, chairperson of Oman PHPS, stressed the importance of voluntary work and the great effort that has been exerted by these volunteers. She added that this initiative was launched to appreciate and gratitude those volunteers that providing the required health care for the infected cases in Ad Life Hospital coming from various governorates. Al-Fana pointed out also that having these volunteers helped the health sector to perform its functions to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Chairperson of Oman PHPS, Al-Fana, added that there is an intention to replicate this initiative in other hospitals over the Sultanate to honor the health workers, particularly those working in the ICUs. Furthermore, Al-Aremi thanked all the sponsors, including enterprises, firms, and individuals who provided the necessary support to make this initiative successful. Real estate developers and property renters in Oman have requested for creation of a fund to provide them financial relief during these tough, unprecedented times. The request was made to the Oman Chamber of Commerce and Industry during a meeting organized by the body to ask people involved in the real estate sector about the challenges they have faced during the COVID-19 pandemic so that solutions may be found to ease their difficulties. The creation of this fund is one of many solutions suggested by property owners and tenants, with the suggested means of funding being contributions from private organizations and members of the public, similar to the recently established Job Security Fund. Other solutions suggested included an alternative method for dealing with rent defaulters, making it easier for renters to pay their money online, and for shopping centers and malls to pay a percentage of the money earned from sales as rent, as opposed to the fixed rental fees currently imposed on them. The meeting was organized by the Oman Chamber of Commerce and Industry as part of its attempts to solve the problems encountered by the various economic sectors in the country. It was held by the OCCI's SME and its real estate development and contracting committees and focused on reducing the burdens faced by tenants who rented properties in the country. One of the suggestions made during the meeting was to distinguish between the different categories of tenants and landlords. Tenants would be distinguished on the basis of the property they were renting and the purpose for which they had decided to rent it, such as residential, commercial, industrial, or tourist activities. It's time for a quick commercial break, but stay tuned as we have Mr. Yasin Chowdhury joining us after this commercial break, who will be talking about early termination of lease in COVID-19. So stay tuned. Welcome back to TTV. As I mentioned before going on a short commercial break, that we have Mr. Yasin Chowdhury, who's the head of the corporate advisory at Faqih Co, joining us, who will be talking about basically how to go about paying rents during this unprecedented times. Thank you, Mr. Yasin, for once again joining us.
Thank you very much. It's actually my delight that I've been able to join the show today.
It's always a pleasure to have you on board, Mr. Yasin. So about today's topic, is there any article, is there any clause, any law that talks about rents?
Yeah, in the Sultanate of Oman back in 1989, there is the Royal Declaration and the pronouncement that actually made the tenancy law in Oman. And that's the bone and the cornerstone for the practice and also for the regulation of the relationship between the landlord and the tenants in the Sultanate. And also in the year of 2008, there were a lot of changes and the amendment to that, the tenancy law of Oman. So, and apart from that, there will be some rules and the regulations from the concerned municipalities particular to that area as well. So yes, in terms of the law and the regulations, there are specific laws, the tenancy law in Oman, to regulate this sort of relationship.
And Mr. Yasin, talking about rents, what exactly are the consequences for those who failed to pay their rents before the COVID actually came to Oman? What were the main consequences? What were the penalties that people were that they were owed to pay? Generally,
the position under the tenancy law of Oman before COVID-19 is that the tenant should be paid. The rent should be paid within the 15 days when it becomes due. So that was the general position of law before the COVID-19, and it will continue to be so even in this particular situation. Unless some other terms and conditions are agreed between the tenant and the landlord, or if there is any other specific provisions in the rent agreement between the parties regarding the payment of the rent and the period the rent should be paid, unless this statutory time limit of 15 days for the payment will apply. In terms of the penalty, referring to the tenancy law of the law number 6 of 1989 of the Sultanate, there is no specific penalty for the rent defaulting by the tenant, I would say. Rather, we have to look at the provisions of that particular agreement, whether there is any particular clause referring to or dealing with the rent default by the tenant. And yes, if the landlord if the landlord suffers any damage because of non-payment of rent by the tenant, yes, he can raise the issue with the competent court and ask for compensation. But generally, it's only the unpaid rent, and if we apply the debt interest on it by the court, then that will also be payable by the tenant.
Right, Mr. Yasin, so these were the penalties and the consequences of the defaulters before COVID-19 came to Oman. Has this remained the same even during COVID-19 situation, or things have changed?
Yes, there are different decisions from the Supreme Committee dealing with COVID-19 and also from other authorities, given the unprecedented situation of COVID-19 and the way it has impacted the real estate business and the parties concerned. Yes, we will discuss about these decisions maybe in the later stage of the show. So far as the position to pay the rent, it will remain the same unless the tenants or the renters can prove that the COVID-19 has actually affected their situations to pay the rent. Unless they can do that, their position to pay or their obligation to pay the rent will remain the same. Yes, they have to pay the rent on time. And when I say on time, it will be the time agreed in the rent agreement, either 7 days or first week of the month, or it may be, as I said, the statutory time is the first 15 days after the rent becomes due. And yes, if the tenant or the renters want to approach the matter in light of COVID-19 and wants to take the advantage of the situation, so to speak, and then he or she, the tenant, has to prove and show that his situation has been affected due to the pandemic. And compared to that, maybe when he approached the matter with the landlord, the matter can be resolved between them, addressing the matter. And then if it's not agreed upon between the parties, given the situation, then the aggrieved party, either tenant or the landlord, can take the matter to a further step.
Right, Mr. Yasin. So you already mentioned that, according to the agreement that the both landlord and tenant can sit together and agree on the feasibility of paying off the rents. But what legal steps can tenant take right now during the COVID-19 situation that would help them with paying off their rents, or maybe exemption or, let's say, reduction for some time? What are the legal procedures? Yes,
we talk about the procedure, then of course the tenant has to notify the landlord about his situation, and then the way his financial position has been affected by the COVID-19. And given the news available from different agencies, we can see the landlord also cooperative in reply to the government urges and the request. And we can see from various real estate companies and also the other concerned authorities that actually rent are reduced to a great extent, and it's very welcome practice in the Sultanate. However, if in any particular situation, if there is no agreement between the tenant and the landlord in terms of the reduction or exemption of rent given the present situation. As I have said, the matter can be dealt with the competent court. But yes, the tenant can actually argue the matter. There is a room under the law itself that yes, if the term of lease is still a long way to go, and if the tenant is very much affected by the COVID-19, then he can actually claim the leverage of force measure in order to terminate the agreement earlier than the usual termination or usual end of the agreement, of the rent agreement. So yes, under the law itself, we can take the matter to the court, asking for the early termination of the contract due to the COVID-19 as a force measure.
Thank you, Mr. Yasin. It's time for us to take a quick commercial break, but stay tuned as we are still in conversation with Mr. Yasin Chowdhury. Welcome back to TTV. You're watching Midday Update, and we are right now in conversation with Mr. Yasin Chowdhury, asking about how to go about paying rents in these difficult times. Mr. Yasin, before going on break, you explained the procedure, you explained the formalities, and you also said that, if there is no such binding between the landlord and the tenant, then the matter can be taken further ahead, right? Recently, you also pointed out that recently many landlords actually have provided some kind of ease to tenants, by giving them some kind of relaxation in terms of paying rent and reducing their rent, or maybe just exempting them from paying rent upon certain conditions. How do you see this step taken by the landlords?
This is very welcoming, to be honest, because under the strict point of law, the landlord are to a great extent in a position to claim the rent, the full payment of rent. Though there are situations, there are other provisions under the law itself to claim the reduction of rent, but it's a long way in the court. But yes, the practice and also the consideration by the landlord of reducing the rent, I would say it's a very welcoming and a very good step. Also try to balance the situation and to overcome the problem caused by COVID-19 and try to move ahead. That's very good practice, and I would say this very good step by the landlord itself. However, what the point we are trying to referring to our previous matter, like in what conditions or under what situations the tenant may have the right to terminate the lease agreement earlier than the end of the term of the lease. And there is a specific provision. It's not under the tenancy law itself. There is no provision in the tenancy law of Oman which deals with the pandemic sort of situation as we are now. But there are the other provision in other areas of law of Sultanate which may be applied in terms of early termination of lease agreement by the tenant, and that's we actually talk. We call it force measure in the legal language. And here, tenants only needs to prove when he claims early termination of the lease agreement. He needs to prove that when they made the agreement, like 5 months ago, 6 months ago, or even 1 year ago, when they made the agreement with the landlord, they actually did not foresee a situation which is now at present that ultimately affected the ability of the tenant to pay the rent. And this is a great sort of a classical textbook example of force measure, this COVID-19, and that will definitely help the tenant to resolve the matter in their favor legally, and will be able to terminate the agreement earlier than the end of the term of the lease.
Right, Mr. Yasin. Talking about the tenants and the agreements right now, a lot of times, or maybe there would be cases there where the tenant is not comfortable affording the current place. And a lot of times it has happened that in the rental agreement, it says that the notice period needs to be served, let's say 3 months or 6 months or 1 month, depending on the agreement binding. In case like if a tenant finds a cheaper place to rent for that time period and he wants to dissolve the contract, how can he go about it without serving the notice period, or let's say, when he cannot afford to serve the notice period as well?
Actually, under the tenancy law of Oman, the general position is when a tenant and the landlord comes to a lease agreement, tenant will not be able to vacate the property before the end of that particular term. This is a general provision. And even the landlord will not be able to request evacuation from the tenant before the end of that particular term as well. Yes, there are some specific situations where the landlord can ask the tenant to vacate the property. For example, the tenant is using the property for something which is not rented for, or the tenant is violating the provisions of the rent agreement itself, or the tenant is subleasing the rented premises. So there are some specific situations in the tenancy law itself which allows the landlord to ask the tenant to evacuate. Apart from those situations, once an agreement is signed and agreed by the tenant and the landlord and registered with the municipality, it will be very difficult to vacate the premises. But in the COVID-19 situation, we're talking about the present pandemic situation. This is unforeseen condition which were not even apprehended by the tenant and the landlord when they came into the agreement. So we can take the tenant who is greatly affected by the COVID-19 can take the benefit of this legal provision. And if he does not want to continue the tenancy with the landlord, he actually can go and terminate the agreement. That's the whole point. However, there is now for this tenant who is not able to afford the current rented premises because of the highest cost, and then he found a cheapest one. I think it will not be sufficient reason for him to vacate. Just because he got a cheapest option, that will not be considered as a sufficient reason to vacate. What he can do is, if his situation is worsened and affected by COVID-19 in the present situation, and that's why if he wants to go to a cheapest option, then yes, again, he can take the leverage of force majeure under the law of Sultanate and try to terminate the first lease agreement, and then he can go for the cheaper option. But only because saving money, only because the tenant cannot afford the higher cost, that will not be considered as a sufficient reason to terminate.
Right, Mr. Yasin. So during this COVID-19 pandemic in the country, have you been receiving a lot of cases or complaints from both tenants and landlords in regards of non-payment of rents?
Yeah, we are receiving. It was even before COVID-19. In our offices, we have been receiving the complaints and also the court cases, both on behalf of the landlord and tenant on the loan, so rent paying defaults, and also for the damage done to the rented premises by the tenant. Yes, but after COVID-19, from June, July, we are receiving the queries even more. As we know, because the tenants, a lot of the tenants are becoming defaulter and they cannot pay the rent on time. So the landlord's queries are even more than the tenants now. Or even sometimes we are receiving queries from the tenants where they are actually subjected to the criminal prosecution following their submission of checks to the landlord as a guarantee, which we will discuss even a bit details later on. So yes, we are receiving the complaints and also queries, and also in some cases we are taking the instructions from the different stakeholders, either tenants and the landlords, that where we think there are good case to argue. And yes, so we are going to take the matter forward.
Right, Mr. Yasin, you're saying that there are more complaints now coming in from landlords than tenants now. Has there been any cases of imprisonment, or like you just said, there was a prosecution charges on a few tenants? Has there been any cases there where a tenant is actually imprisoned and also asked to pay a fine?
Yes, as a part of the practice of taking the rent, generally in the Sultanate, the landlords require a checks from the tenant, and they also sometimes encash those checks as a part of payment of the rent from the tenant. Sometimes they actually return those checks when the cash payment is done by the tenant themselves. Sometimes when those checks are returned from the bank for insufficiency of funds, that time the landlord takes criminal action, which is police case, against the tenant based on the bounced check. So initially, though the whole issue of renting and leasing is civil in nature, it's not criminal, but because of the check that's forwarded by the tenant as a guarantee in the process of taking the rent, actually gives rise to the criminal prosecution, and that also gives a different picture of the situation. And yes, from this part of the practice, because of the check, the landlord are also free to take the criminal action against the defaulted tenant. And also it increased at present time because of the pandemic, the COVID-19. And yes, we are receiving the queries from the landlord to file a criminal case against the tenant based on the check. I just want to add one point here. It will be helpful for our viewers. Yes, when we tender the check, it's not imperative under the law to actually give a check as a mode of payment to the landlord. But if we see the practice, the way it's developed in the Sultanate, the landlords actually ask for check as a mode of guarantee. So I would suggest for the viewers that when they give a check to the landlord as a guarantee for the payment, not as a mode of payment, it actually gives some sort of relief for the tenant if there is a police case against them, to argue that this check does not form the basis of the criminal case. We have done it successfully before, and it's already proven in the court in the Sultanate that if a check which is marked as a guarantee at the backside of the check, and then we can actually say, no, there will not be any police case based on that check, because the check is not used as a mode of payment as it is generally, but rather it used as a mode of guarantee. And when it's used as a mode of guarantee, so it actually doesn't form the basis for the criminal case in the police station. So what I would suggest the viewers to check the back of the check, whether they have marked it as a guarantee before when they took the rent, and now they can take that matter and argue that the case in that direction. So that will be one word of precaution going forward, that because they are not tendering the check as a payment, they're tendering as a mode of guarantee. So it's better to write at the back of the check, yes, it's the guarantee check. And that will give extra room and extra space for the tenant to argue in the court.
Right, Mr. Yasin. We actually have got a question from Leo Charles on our Facebook platform. He's asking that if tenant has lost his job during agreement period, what happens then? If the tenant has lost his job.
Yeah, I believe the tenant has lost a job during this COVID-19 situation, and if it is the case, it will be a great option, and it will be a great argument for the tenant to ask the landlord to terminate the agreement. If the landlord does not agree, then we can take the matter in the competent court to actually vacate the property on the ground of force majeure. And this will be a very good case for the tenant to take it to that direction if the landlord does not agree with the early termination.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Yasin, for answering to that question. On this note, we are going to wrap our show for today. We'll be back again next week. Thank you once again, Mr. Yasin, for actually giving such a brief and such an insightful information about how to go about paying tenants and how to dissolve the agreement, how to ask for some kind of relief in terms of rents and exemption. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the viewers for joining in today's episode. We'll be back again next week on Monday with latest updates your way. So stay tuned and keep watching TTV.